and violence. Anna can speak to a variety of topics that she works on, from women's health to LGBTQ rights to reducing gun violence. She's appeared on CBS Face the Nation, NPR's All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and now you can add to your bio Women on the Week. So we have had quite the week. We've got a lot to talk about in a half an hour. So let's get started. Laura, I really want to start with you just very, very quickly. Can you kind of recap the high holidays this year? I mean, I saw everything from outdoor services to hearing about Rabbi Angela Buckdall's very moving sermon on race. So, what are your thoughts?
I think just first and foremost, I have spoken to rabbis from every major denomination, and I am just amazed by the astounding leadership in the Jewish community, and the creativity and innovation that went into making this year safe and meaningful and uplifting. There were a lot of outdoor services with social distancing. I personally was in a nice tent that was only a few times interrupted by lawnmowers during services. And, you know, despite some tech challenges, there were a lot of really beautiful multimedia high holiday services that were live streamed. And I think actually for a lot of people, myself included, because the traditional prayer services were shortened or changed up a little bit, I think breaking up routine actually adds a lot of meaning. And I personally just felt so uplifted. And, you know, I had a little bit more time to read and just kind of contemplate. It's been such a tough year that I think it was a beautiful respite from a lot of that. You know, the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, unfortunately, for a lot of people that saw it before the holiday began or while the holiday began, definitely put a damper on Rosh Hashanah for a lot of people. I thankfully didn't find out until after the holiday, so didn't have that same experience. But I think it just, you know, encapsulates a lot of what has happened in 2020, that there have been so many beautiful things that have arisen because of really the challenges that we've been facing as a nation and community.
I think you're right. There was something powerful in that, in the work and the innovation to keep the traditions, to make it happen. You know, when things come so easily, you don't appreciate them as much as when you have to really work to create them. And I found comfort in that, of really seeking out a way of creating the holidays this year. I thought was beautiful. But you know, you talked about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing, and I think that um, kind of is the perfect segue into one of the major topics we're going to discuss today. Anna, I kind of want to throw this to you. Can you talk about the nomination of Judge Barrett? What it means, you know, for those of us in the DC bubble, we're so inside it. Do people care about the Supreme Court nominee in this fight? How will this affect the election?
Well, those are two different questions because on the one hand, I think most voters don't care that much. Generally speaking, they don't know very much about the Supreme Court. They don't know what it does. They don't generally know how many people are on it. They have an idealized view of what the court sort of represents. So if you ask people how they feel about the court, it generally has pretty high trust and favorability ratings, even though those of us that know it's a highly partisan and political entity that has been, in my view, not necessarily always a force for good since 2000. But that's not how your sort of average voter sees it. But I do think that this particular, the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and this particular nomination fight actually does have an impact on the election. And I think primarily by hardening, solidifying, motivating Democratic voters. And I think that when she first passed and people had initial reaction, it would help Republicans because Republicans tend to care more about judges than Democrats do. Average voters, that I mean. But, you know, my view is anybody who cared about judges on either side, left or right, already knows who they're, you know, Mitch McConnell has already done, you know, the Lord's work in the Republican Party on, you know, getting judges appointed. But I think that the kind of political nature of it, for someone who is probably outside of Thurgood Marshall, the best known Supreme Court justice ever, I put her, I'm doing lots of campaigns right now. So I put her in the favorability battery in lots of different congressional districts and states. And, the lowest I got on her was 54% favorable. Mostly it was in the 60s, which is kind of remarkable. And like over 90% knowing who she is. But I think the political nature of kind of jamming it through really fast is completely transparent to people what's happening. And I just actually am doing an analysis for a presentation I'm doing in like an hour where I put together a model of presidential vote. And while not surprisingly, handling coronavirus and the economy are strong predictors of the vote, but so is the Supreme Court nomination fight in terms of how you think Trump's doing on it. I think, if you need to look no further than Act Blue, the weekend of the high holidays, when it raised $100 million, mostly for Senate races in the wake of her passing. So ultimately, I don't think it matters in the sense that lots of people care deeply about the court, but I do think it matters because it's like another insult, insult to injury for Democrats. And it really, I can see all of my surveys have come in more Democratic than they should be. Which generally means there's more Democratic enthusiasm. And I've been trying to temper that with my clients and saying, well, this may just be like, this week, and then next week it'll go back to the norm. But I see a lot of evidence of, like I said, kind of Democratic energy around it.
Go ahead.
I agree with Anna that about everything she said about the way it will play out for Democrats. But I think I'm not sure I agree about Republicans. I think that, and it's going to be really hard to tell in the rearview mirror because this nomination is it's soon. It's so tight. The debate happened 3 days later, and so there's a lot of noise in all the polling and everything that's going to happen. But I think that Republicans. I think there is a large swath of religious Republicans who are deeply invested in the abortion question in particular, who may have been quite concerned about President Trump's handling of the pandemic and some of his rhetoric, and had been sort of disappointed and may have been not rushing to the polls, who may be motivated by the idea of a sort of really hardening majority, conservative majority on the Supreme Court. And I think it may play out in those Senate races. There was some amazing polling right before Ginsburg died about some of the toss-up Senate races and the Republican incumbents really being in trouble. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of those flop because of the Supreme Court fight. I mean, again, it's like now we've had this crazy debate thrown into it, and who knows what will happen the next 5 weeks. But I feel like it's a motivator on both sides, this nomination fight.
I just want to add a little bit anecdotally. I'm not so sure if for Republicans, at least to folks I've been speaking to, I think the Supreme Court was kind of a given for a lot of people, that Trump was going to continue nominating as many conservative justices, not just in the Supreme Court, but in lower courts as well. But most Republican voters that I speak to who are still voting for Trump, it's how they perceive his handling of the economy by and large, and the strength in their view of his rhetoric, at least, if not actual policy on the coronavirus pandemic. The debate in particular, I heard from a lot of people, he seems strong, he seems forceful. And, as I've said before on this panel, I do just really feel like people hear tone a lot more than specifics at this point in the game. And, I was actually speaking to someone I'm very close to who was a Democrat and really likes Trump's handling of the economy. And I brought up how he's been nominating a lot of conservative justices before Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing. And they're like, I kind of forgot about the fact that was his main job. So I think for a small group of people who are still making up their minds, I don't think that's a large group at this point, but there might be some shift. But, I think what'll be interesting is looking at the confluence of, how much this motivates people to go out that were not planning on voting. And then also, what really matters here is how much voter suppression, whether intentional or unintentional, we see. In New York, we've had so much. It's kind of a disaster with how a lot of ballots have gone out with incorrect names and addresses. And I think we live in such an age of distrust and misinformation already that, more mistakes like that could happen that could, I think, really impact, what happens. So,
But Laura, I wonder if you're being hopeful in thinking that those, like your friend who once you said you reminded them that that the courts are thinking about, these nominations to the Supreme Court would overturn the ACA or Roe, and then they're kind of rethinking support of Trump. I wonder how many are saying the opposite, which is, I don't care. I don't need an abortion, or I have the money to get an abortion if I need it. I have the money to have health care. All I care about is the stock market, and therefore I'll support Trump. Anna, what are you hearing with all of this? What are the polls saying? Granted, take them with a grain of salt, but
I don't take them with a grain of salt. I do them, and they're accurate. I mean, look, nothing's really nothing. If you go back over the course of the entire year, Biden. But let's just say from when he secured the nomination, Biden's had anywhere from a 6 to 10 point lead consistently. And there have been times where it's narrowed a little bit. So in that brief moment where it looked like Trump might actually be presidential and do something about coronavirus, his job performance improved a little bit and the vote narrowed a little bit. And then when there was utter failure and economic crash, particularly in July, when you had the cases sort of out of control in the Southwest and in the southern states, where it was wall-to-wall coverage, it was just terrible. And so he saw Biden go up to his biggest lead, and he's now in that range of his biggest lead, not just nationally, but in the battleground states. And so many battleground polls have, like Wisconsin has Biden above 50. And so it's been stable, but getting progressively worse for Trump since July. And like I said, in the last 2 weeks, but particularly right after Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed, we saw a big jump in Democratic enthusiasm, and a lot of my polls coming in sort of with a higher Democratic identification than it should have. Being conservative, I weighted it down more close to what it had been before because I didn't want to artificially inflate, because in a moment of time there was Democratic energy. But then you had the release of Trump's taxes, and then you had the debate, which the consensus is he lost. The consensus is very negative. Every piece of research I've seen suggests that he did not do himself any favors. And even though Biden wasn't perfect, and the Proud Boy comment in particular, and this is where I did disagree a little bit on his just tone, the Proud Boy comment, just like Charlottesville, was really stands out to people. And his mealy-mouthed, walk back yesterday, I guess. So,
is there any polling post? I know it's very soon after the debate, but have you seen any flash polls?
There's about 7 polls. And I'll show anywhere from like 55 to 60 or 70% say that Biden won it, but and there's no poll that says Trump won that debate. But again, I mean, the Biden's margin's so big right now, it's hard to imagine it getting much bigger. And like I said, I'm really mostly focused on what's actually happening in the states and not the national polls. So I don't see much. Honestly.
Historically, how important are presidential debates to voter decisions?
Not that important, but like certainly if like Biden had fallen asleep during the debate or something, it would have been a huge problem. I mean, I think that there are lots of ways that could have gone sideways, that it could have hurt Biden. I don't, on the other hand, like, I don't think that Trump's actually got the capacity to be a different person, but like if he came to the debate as a slightly different person, it might, just like if he had been a different president when coronavirus hit, he had opportunities this year to improve his standing. He's always missed that opportunity or deliberately has sort of decided strategically the only thing that matters is his base.
So one of the things about the debate, like if they do debate again, the bar is now, I mean, he could improve the expectations now are so low, and it's always about beating expectations. So it feels like he does have some running room now to make something with another debate if there is one. Yeah,
I think he will improve because it's a town hall format. So he'd have to attack Biden while Biden was talking to another human being. Not, of course, Wallace. And if he does that, like, mind blown. But it seems like he might have to hold. The format's different, I think.
It'll be interesting to see what he does, because this was the debate structure where he hovered over Hillary. We all remember those moments, and I'm curious what the changes will be to the debate format. You know, they're talking about being able to somehow mute or turn off the microphone if someone, but again, you'll still be able to hear, and it'll still disrupt the other speaker. So I wonder how much power they have to really control someone like Trump on the debate stage.
And I wonder, one of the things I thought was really interesting, and a lot of commentators were talking about before the Proud Boys comment, was the way that Biden didn't look at Trump and looked instead at the camera. And having coached candidates, I wonder if you could talk about what was your thought about that?
Well, I think it's very smart. You want to, when you're debating someone who's going to kind of constantly try to attack you and get you off your game, the way to stay focused is to focus on the moderator or the audience and speak to them. And to the degree possible, not say not to actually speak to them directly. Now, he had his moments where he said, "Shut up, man," and called him a clown. But I think the problem was that Trump was so over the top that in normal times, if Biden had said, "Shut up, man," it would be like, everyone would have lost their minds. But because
and it
in relation to what Trump was doing,
minds.
And
that clown line, it was funny because he then kind of apologized, like under his he's like, I mean,
president.
I'm so uncomfortable that I just said that, right?
Right. So I think it's actually the smartest thing for Biden to do, because I think actually Trump, I think in debates in 2016, he was not, I mean, Hillary Clinton was brilliant at debating and she won all those debates, but certainly in the Republican primaries, he was very good at knocking people off their game by insulting them and things like that. And then getting them in a kind of back and forth, petty back and forth, which you can't win with him. So I think it's a deliberate and smart strategy on Biden's part.
I think I love those moments where Biden just closed his eyes and kind of took a deep breath and tried to calm himself, where you just
that was all of us.
I know what you're feeling. Exactly. We're taking that breath. Laura, what are you hearing people are talking about, coming out of the debates, with hearing about the poll watchers in Philly? I think they're now sweatshirts that say, what is it? Terrible things happen in Philadelphia that all of my friends back home are buying. What should we be talking about right now when it comes to voting and when it comes to the election?
Yeah, I think there is more noise and chatter than there was even in 2016. Just in general, like we're seeing everything from, this anonymous Biden beauty blender brand that's selling these, tote bags and beauty blenders for $20.20, to, QAnon conspiracies. I've been speaking to a lot of researchers who track the metastasization of extremist views online, and there's so much, unfortunately, very educated people falling for or being targeted by conspiracy theories, political ads. I think what I'm watching most closely and I guess most concerned about is, as I mentioned, how is it going to play out both on election day with people able to access the polling stations themselves, and then what happens with early voting and mail-in voting. I don't think, and Anna probably knows better than I do, but I don't think there's a lot of undecided folks left. I'm always impressed how they manage to find them when they do the town hall debates. But, I think that I'm watching very closely what actual access to our right to vote looks like. It's a long, short time until election day. So of course there could be a new scandal or a new news drop, but we've seen that Trump is pretty much Teflon, but we've also seen that, Joe Biden has never been trailing Trump in national polls. So while he may be, the sleepy Joe, less exciting candidate, I think he actually does have a lot of sticking power in the minds of voters. So I'm most concerned with actual access to people's right to exercise their right to vote. And again, there's a lot of scary disinformation happening that, does have the power to influence what we see. So that's what I'm most closely watching.
Anna, who are the undecideds? And what are they?
There aren't any. There aren't any.
Like what more? Oh, so there aren't any.
It's like 2%, and it's much lower than previous election cycles. And honestly, anybody who says they're undecided in a poll right now is probably not actually a voter. We try our best to get likely voters in our surveys, but it's, is probably not someone who's actually really going to vote. And I think that I have the same concern that Laura does, that in a lot of ways, what Democrats and progressives are worried about, the ones I talk to, are less, Biden's margin or the margin of the candidates down the ballot, which are very closely tied to Biden. Most of the Senate and House races I'm working in, those votes look identical to the presidential vote. Is that issue of access. On the other hand, the early news is good. 2.17 million people have already voted. They're heavily Democratic, 54%, based on where we have registration. Not every state has registration, but party registration, but where we do, they're almost 55% Democratic. In focus group research that I've been working on with a coalition of folks over the last week and a half, heavily focused on this issue, we find people not discouraged at all by it. And I think that was one of our concerns, that low propensity, less informed voters would be kind of discouraged by the thought that there might be protesters at the polls, or their vote might not get counted or might get lost in the mail. And their reaction to it is to figure out they're figuring out plans to vote, right? Like, I'm going to take my mail-in ballot and I'm going to put it in the box, not the mailbox, things like that. So it's not going to be perfect. I mean, I worry about a state like Pennsylvania, which is having vote by mail for the first time. And they had a lot of challenges in counting the votes in the primary there. I don't think it was just a Philly problem, but other states, like Arizona, for example, which is, obviously got a huge Senate race as well as the presidential, they are very well versed in vote by mail. They know how to count, no one's worried about it. So at least what's happening right now, as people are already voting, things seem okay in terms of people, and it's very, you can't really compare to 2016 because a lot of the rules have been changed in different states and we're in the middle of a pandemic. So you would expect to see more people voting at this stage than you would anyway. But, I think there's a consensus that it's higher, about 10% higher than 2016.
You're right.
And
There's
so interesting
on that plan to vote.
Mm-hmm.
Jody, go ahead.
I was just, that's really interesting it feels really clear that this is a turnout election, not, a swinging anybody's changing minds election. And both sides are really focused on base plus whatever that is. So you just talked about how the issue of access and fraud might affect, depress, or not turnout. I'm wondering what you think about how the debate and the tenor of the campaign might affect turnout. I found myself, it was interesting. I'm on a text, just my friend text chain, which is not people involved in the media or in politics, just a bunch of moms. All the texts during the debate were like, gross. I'm, I feel gross. I feel ashamed to be American. It was just this is, and I think the viewership was incredibly high. And there was just a sense of this sucks. There's so much criticism of our system in general, totally when I covered the 2004 presidential campaign, people were obsessed about how bad our politics was. I had been feeling like the stakes of this election are so much higher than usual because everybody's living through these crises of the pandemic and the economy, and there's reckoning. Although it's also harder to vote in some ways. Now we have this kind of just chaos, and as some of our colleagues said on cable, shit show. I wonder how you think that just ick feeling about the debate will affect turnout.
I don't think it will.
Okay.
I think turnout's be off the charts. I mean, it can't, if you look at the difference between, say, 2014 and 2018, the difference in turnout was massive. You can't apply that level of turnout to 16 and 20 because it would be more people than actually are eligible to vote in this country. But, wow. You're going to see a bump in turnout from 2016. And I think you're going to have Democrats, people who are voting Democratic, desperate for new leadership, desperate for a return to normalcy, just desperate for it. And you just see it in every aspect. On the other hand, you're going to have Republicans who, it's not a majority, but it's a smaller group, 42, 45%, who are desperate not to lose power. And I just think everyone's going to come out and vote. I think the group that is of most concern to me in terms of turnout are younger people of color. That would be the group where I see more evidence of not really being that into Biden and already being a group that are less likely to vote. That's kind of where my concern is. And they did not show up for Hillary in 2016.
Do you see any evidence that that the selection of Kamala Harris has affected that?
Not really.
Weren't they saying that earlier, that there wasn't necessarily that automatic support for Kamala because she's a woman of color? So that wasn't a determining factor. And I agree. I think if anything, after the debates, I'm more inspired to not have that feeling again.
Right,
There
exactly.
were reports that were somehow attempting to equivocate Biden saying you're a clown or shut up, man, with the horrendous things that Trump said, which bothered me that that's the way it was being reported. But I can't imagine anyone coming away from it thinking that that was anything but what Trump was doing to the debate process.
I, you know,
That.
I'm actually looking forward to the vice presidential debate because I think, you know, whether or not you agree with their positions, Mike Pence and Kamala Harris are both very nuanced, policy oriented people. So I do think that debate is going to give us a little insight as to, you know, what the next 4 years of our country's governance on the executive level might look like, because both of them would be, you know, big hands in shaping policy. So I, you know, anecdotally, I think most young people of color and just liberal voters in general that I speak to think Kamala Harris is more, you know, pro cops and things that aren't necessarily in line with their views. But I don't think anyone thinks that she's not a nuanced thinker with a long history of helping shape public response to major issues. So I personally am hopeful that that debate will be, you know, more of a McCain-Romney mashup than this last unfortunate episode in our country's long history. So I'm optimistic for that.
Anna, how much will the VP debate, do you think, affect things? Will we see any kind of movement in the polls or nothing?
You can be sure not.
Not at all.
Definitely, there's no example of a vice presidential debate in history having any impact on anything.
Although there was that classic line of "I knew JFK, John Kennedy."
Yeah, it didn't have anything to do with the outcome of the election.
And they lost.
Well, I see that our time is starting to wrap up. Jody, I want to turn to you. We lost, surprisingly, I didn't realize she was Jewish. Quite a consequential woman in our culture, Helen Reddy. I believe both the Forward and JTA wrote about her. But Jody, did you want to talk about the piece that you all published?
I not so much about the piece, but I just so the last 2 years running, my husband, our synagogue has a massive Purim spiel. They're really into it, and my husband is the director. And so for the last 2 years, we've had the after party at our house. And this was also like the last thing that happened before the pandemic shutdown. And at the end of both of those parties, me and several of the other women sort of shut the place down by dancing to I Am Woman. So that's my lasting memory of her. And I've been playing that in my head all week.
Well, we should keep that going in our head as we march to the polls in the next few weeks. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that today is October 1st, is the start of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. For those of you who don't know, this is at the core of JWI's work to end violence against women and girls. There has been an uptick of violence during COVID as stressors, economic stressors, quarantining together are just exacerbating violence. And it's making harder for women who are forced to quarantine with their abusers to leave and to seek help. We just launched actually a needs assessment survey to Jewish domestic violence providers that will go out, that will take a hard look at what's needed not only by survivors but by providers, and where there are gaps and what we need to fill in order to provide support. And those of you on the call will be getting an email with links to some webinars coming up where you can learn more about the intersection of violence and race and what's happening right now under COVID. So I want to thank everyone for being on the call today. Anna, power to your pollster power. So thank you for everything. Jody, Laura, thank you again for joining me, and to all of you. Have a good Sukkot. And thank you all, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, Meredith.